Well, hello, everybody. This is the Midweek Hello for May 13th, I think. Here's my question I'm thinking about today. I did some journaling on this earlier, and it was quite actually kind of a great exercise. But here's the question I started with. What if we were really finally honest with ourselves, with one another, but I think particularly with ourselves? I think I am grappling in this strange time. I hear a lot of sort of jokes about introverts and extroverts. And there's a lot of truth to those things. But as a people-oriented person, in a kind of isolation, it means all of the things that I do to recharge my batteries and feel whole and good and generally connected and, oriented as to kind of my place in the world have kind of, for the most part, disappeared, which is really painful and really taking a toll. And I know, for many, many people, that's church. So, there's so much feeling about, not just missing church, but what I think that signifies and symbolizes for many of us. I was just on a long meeting with some clergy about, what will reopening look like? And, similar to the Massachusetts governor, we're talking about a phased plan. And right now we're in phase 1, which is kind of, total lockdown, and phase 2 is not anything anyone is hoping for. That's kind of the most we can say, but it means, really, really strict distances to the point where the big question is going to be, do we even go to phase 2 or do we wait for phase 3? So that's some of the discussion that clergy are having, and what that means. And there was a really smart observation about, people somehow expect church to remain the same, even when everything else in the world is different. I thought, wow, that sounds about right. So I'm thinking, so I went into that conversation with this question about honesty and knowing that my own feelings and discomfort with sort of being trapped with myself, by myself, so much of the time, is bringing up, and how often I look to other, whether it's people, events, activities, targets almost, to sort of offload that discomfort. And that shows up in these weird stories that I don't really consciously tell myself, except that that's what I'm doing, which is, well, once I can do X, then I'll feel okay. Or, well, if I can just talk to so-and-so, then I'll feel okay. If we can just get to this way of doing things, then everything will be okay, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of these stories, I am assigning my own discomfort to circumstances in the world. Well, this is a dangerous thing because we have very little control over most circumstances in the world. So it's like I'm making a deal with myself to not be okay, whatever that means or feels like in the moment, until certain conditions are met. And I think the deepest truth about faith is that there's an underlying enoughness, even when circumstances are not quite okay. And I think this is the deep truth that we hear from people who've been in far less than ideal circumstances. Nelson Mandela comes to mind. I think I'm going to read his biography because he made it for 27 years under house arrest and came out this incredible, brilliant reconciler. Okay. I want to know what he's doing because that's doing it right. So these are my questions. And I think it has to do with this honesty thing, because I think I can't actually address the scared parts of myself, the hurt, parts of myself, the lonely parts, the sad parts, the just totally terrified parts, unless I'm honest. And when I cover over those uncomfortable feelings of fear and worry and loneliness and disorientation with these stories that are sort of, psychologists would call them maladaptive strategies, but they're just false stories that insulate us a little bit from the bigness of our feelings. It's better instead to just deal with the feelings. So, one of my sisters, she's going to kill me. One of my sisters called me this week and was like, do you have any meditation tips? And I said, well, meditation's not like a drug. You can't just sort of like take this pill like a take this strategy like a pill and that'll make this feel better. Meditation, like prayer, is only as good as the time that you've already logged in some senses. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of people sort of reevaluating their strategies for coping. A friend of mine works in sort of, public religious research, and, he wrote recently that 46% of young people or millennials or something have taken up a spiritual practice since this pandemic began. And that's fantastic. And I think, to the extent our practices make us more honest rather than numb us to discomfort, those are the things that are going to help us grow, to cope, to become like so much of this fantastic greenness and be living, flexible branches that can adapt, can bend with the stresses, but not break. That's the way of Nelson Mandela and others. That's the way of growing through the midst of uncertainty and fear and all those things. So there will be a lot of conversations in the weeks ahead about how we're trying to be with one another, how logistically we can be with one another, and what forms that might take. But first of all, it requires honesty, our full-hearted honesty. And there's some vulnerability in that, right? It's scary to admit how scary this is, I think, for most of us. So what would it mean for you to be completely honest with yourself, with God, with whoever you might live with or care about or be caring for, even at a distance? What would that honesty look like? What would that sort of love look like? I don't know, but I'd love to hear how you're working through these questions, because they are ripe ones and they're pointy and they're juicy and they're all those human life things. So blessings, peace, and have a good rest of the week.